Dr. Chandra Lal Pandey and dear participants, very good afternoon and welcome to NICE webinar on politics of climate change and Nepal. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical and non-partisan think tank. It believes in freedom, democracy and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Climate change is one of our major research topics. As you know that Nepal lies between India and China, the world's largest carbon emitting countries of the world. Climate change is of grave concern to us. Due to the melting of snow-capped mountains, the glaciers have started to burst. We all are aware of the May 2012 incident where 10 people were killed and 60 got missing due to the bursting of glaciers. In order to draw attention in December 2009, on the eve of the 2009 United Nations Climate Change Conference, Copenhagen, Nepal hosted a climate meeting on climate change at the Mount Everest Base Camp, the highest altitude in the world. In terms of climate change vulnerability, Nepal is ranked 13 in the world. In this context, we have invited Dr. Chandra Lal Pandey to speak on the politics of climate change and Nepal. Dr. Chandra Lal Pandey is a program coordinator and assistant professor of community development program, School of Arts, Kathmandu University. Prior to this, he worked in the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy and the Department of Crisis Management Studies, Tribhuvan University. He earned his PhD on climate change governance and post-doctorate on environment affairs. He has over 15 years of work experience in South Asia, particularly in Nepal and India. He has an extensive working experience in the field of public policy, environmental affairs, climate change adaptation, the forest management and community resilience. He has also extensive experience in action and traditional research methods, design and analysis, institutional analysis, participatory planning, deliberate stakeholder engagement, community development, project management, and participation and partnership development with various tiers of government institutions, think tank organizations, NGOs, and universities. He has worked on several projects that has focused on the cross-cutting themes of climate change, water, urban water security and transboundary water governance, community resilience and DDR, capacity building of national and local government institutions, and sustainable development. His track record of high quality publication is significant. He co-edited the book Environmental Security in the Asia Pacific, published in June 2019 by Palgrave Macmillan in the United States. His co-author book, Why REDD Will Fail, published in 2016 by Routledge Studies in Environmental Policy. He has also published several research articles in a number of leading international peer-reviewed journals, focusing on climate change policies and DDR, including the journal Global Environmental Policies, Environmental Values, Water, Asian Security, Disaster Prevention and Management, and Environment Development and Sustainability. He supervises master's, MPhil and PhD students in area of his expertise. He also serves as a reviewer and editor of a number of international quality peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Pandey, let me once again welcome you to the program. You will have around 30 to 35 minutes to make a remark, which will be followed by question and answers. I would also like to request our participants to share their question in Zoom chat as well as on the Facebook Live. Please feel free to share our live program on your social media. Dr. Pandey, the floor is yours. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pramod, for inviting me for this talk. You have already given a very long introduction of mine. Thank you very much for that. And some background on climate change condition of Nepal. So you have already, done almost some of the work for me. Thank you very much for that. Good afternoon, everyone. Now let me begin with my presentation. Okay, today I'll be talking about climate change politics, particularly capturing global, let's say, climate change politics, and then where is Nepal in this global climate change politics? Okay. Now, first of all, let me briefly share, I know all of you know about it, but let me briefly set the context or the background for the talk today. First of all, I would like to talk a little bit about understanding climate change, although I don't talk quite a lot about science, but even people from social science and other backgrounds also, they need to understand a little bit about it. So when we talk about climate change, we have two different types of understanding here today. For example, one is natural climate change, and it is, the studies have shown that before 1700s, we used to have natural climate change in the world. Climate would change in natural process. It can be global warming, it can be global cooling, but you can see the history of climate change in the past. Global cooling, global warming, both of these things occurred, but through natural processes. However, since, let's say, 1800, we have started to feel a different kind of climate change, which is called anthropogenic climate change or human-made climate change, right? Particularly when our age of industrialization, age of enlightenment began. With that, we have lots of developments happening in the world. And with those kinds of development, let's say, invention of machines, etc., transport system, we started to enter into a new age, which is called anthropogenic climate change. And today, anthropogenic climate change is actually predominant. That's what the studies have shown, okay? And when you talk about climate change is a very interesting topic, a very complex topic also, because when we talk about this anthropogenic climate change, it is related with human life, human facilities, human innovation, human inventions, right? For example, early in the morning, we get up, wash our face, we use water. Then we think that we go to office, right? But then we use transportation, okay? So in this way, our minor activities do contribute to this anthropogenic climate change. Therefore, even if, the countries all over the world, they want to contribute to address climate change, it's becoming difficult. Now, there are debates. When it's difficult, there are always debates. And debates means politics again, because when there are disagreements, that's what we need to understand as politics, okay? So there are debates. For example, one is this natural or anthropogenic, predominantly in this, let's say, in the world of, let's say, Asia, South Asia, Latin America, and many other parts of the world, scientists completely agree that it's anthropogenic climate change which is occurring today. But still, in English-speaking world, if you go to US and see, what some scientists are saying, while what others are saying, you can see some kind of disagreement in terms of climate change which is occurring today. Although the large percentage of scientists, for example, about 98-99% of scientists all over the world, they believe that, according to the data, their findings, that climate change is anthropogenic of today. But a small number of scientists, or let's say politicians, scientists, something like that, they argue that it's still natural. And there are, debates in terms of what kinds of solutions need to be solved. Okay, so that is one politics of global climate change. And another is climate change, happening because of rich or because of poor? Okay, that is another, let's say, climate change debate in global politics, right? And you must have heard about this North-South politics also, which we will deal shortly, right? But then we need to understand that in each rich and poor countries, there can be pockets of rich people and pockets of poor people also, okay? So it's not only the rich countries, okay, even in poor countries also, there can be pockets of rich people which may be engaged in emitting equivalent to the people who live in advanced countries, okay? This is something as a debate going on. And the third debate is who has a responsible shoulder the burden of addressing climate change, okay? We have already this anthropogenic human-made climate change here today. We are facing it, we are realizing it, okay? But then there's a debate. Now, who should take the responsibility to address climate change? And particularly the burden, that means financial burden, technological burden, okay? Who is going to take responsibility of those kinds of things? That is another debate, which is ongoing since 1972. Now, North-South policy debates. Also, there are policy-related debates as well. For example, should we limit global temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius? Okay, you can see a number of, let's say, important milestone type of summits and let's say meetings every year. You must have heard, like, at one time, these global politicians, global leaders, they gather together and then they declare that we should limit global temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Other time, at other meeting, they say that it can go up to 2 degrees Celsius. And if you look at this, latest one, which is called that powerful agreement, Paris Agreement, it also envisions that global temperature would rise up to 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, so there is still debate, and different countries have, different kind of say on it. Okay, least developed countries, or island countries, they say that it must be limited at 1.5 degrees Celsius, whereas advanced countries or emerging economies, well, for example, countries of basics and BRICS, they think that we can move up to 2 degrees Celsius. So there is debate. And there's another debate on mitigation or adaptation. Okay, mitigation or adaptation. For example, should we engage only on mitigation, or should we focus on adaptation, right? If we only want to focus on adaptation, then it can relate to pay and pollute, right? Pay and pollute, okay? Because adaptation is mainly thought that it's feasible and suitable for less developed countries and developing countries. So what about the developed countries or advanced countries then? Should they engage in mitigation or not? Okay, that's another debate, another politics of, let's say, climate change policy. And then policies for mitigation, for example, what type of policies should be utilized? Kyoto Protocol, one, we have Kyoto Protocol. It's already over until 2020. So in Kyoto Protocol, we have CGM, right? Type of mechanism which offered flexible mechanism, right? For example, emission trading units or schemes, and then joint implementation, etc. Okay, so there were debates at the time on these types of mechanisms as well. And then, another very important debate today is how should the world go ahead now from this point? Okay, should we continue business as usual model, or should we go to low carbon green economy? Okay, so models of development, this is also highly debated, policy topic or politics of climate change. Now, another important thing we need to understand about climate change politics is, this north-south, or let's say east-west, whatever we call, advanced countries and then, developing countries or developed countries or developing countries, whatever we call, the concerns of development. And it started since 1972 from, let's say, Stockholm Conference, right? Generally, when we look at different literature, what we find is, Western countries, advanced countries, they seem to be giving emphasis on environmental issues, okay? Whereas developing countries, for example, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, okay? These countries, they prioritize development upon environmental issues, okay? Because they think that raising the standards of living is very, very important. Okay, so there is this kind of debate also. And many developing countries, they think that environmental issues are blocked or are ploy to stop their, let's say, opportunities for development. That's what they think of also. So we need to understand about this north-south politics of environmental issues as well, climate change issues as well, all right? Developing countries and less developed countries, they think that it's their time to develop, right? Whereas, let's say, Western countries, they think that, well, it's time to focus on addressing climate change problems and environmental issues, okay? And there is conflict, right? And we can also imagine, okay, if we have this business as usual scenario of development, on which path Western countries, advanced countries develop themselves, we continue to develop, let's say, a large number of population in India and in China, then what would happen to Earth and what would be the rate of climate change in the future, okay? So that is something when you think of. And at the same time, when you think of How do we develop then? Because we need to take millions of people out of poverty. We need to upgrade the standard of living of all these people. Obviously, yes. So what is the way? Okay, so that's also something we need to think of. And you can see here, international equity and responsibility. There's a huge gap between rich countries and poor countries, because you can say that simply in US, per capita income is like $46,000, right? And in Nepal, it's not even $1,000, it's less than that, right? So how do we maintain this international equity, and how do we understand the politics of development then? Okay, so these are some of the things we need to understand about climate change politics. And this is again linked to burden sharing and funding. Who is going to share the burden? Who is going to fund, let's say, adaptation, mitigation, or any initiative or innovation that is going to be developed for addressing climate change. Now, if you look at current status of Nepal, I don't really bring a lot of, let's say, detailed data because I'm talking about politics more today. But then again, if you look at Nepal, Nepal's, let's say, average type of annual temperature today is about 0.6 degrees Celsius, okay? Particularly if you look at Tarai region, it's like 0.4, and if you look at the Himalaya, then it's 0.8 degrees Celsius. So what we see is the rates of increase is higher in the mountains than in other regions in Nepal. That is the status of Nepal. And you see that, the global population that reside in Nepal is 0.4% only. And then Nepal's contribution to global greenhouse, let's say, gases emission is only 0.25% of total global emissions in the world. So here you can see that we have a small number of population, our emission contribution is very, very small, right? Whereas, let's say, the temperature rise is very, very high, okay, particularly in mountain regions. And you can see the impacts of this, let's say, global temperature rise disproportionately in different parts of Nepal. As I already said, in mountains, temperature is rising rapidly compared to other region, and it is also affecting, our glaciers, our annual rainfall patterns, droughts, etc., and particularly the water towers of Asia. Some of the examples which you can see here are in the past 90 years, a glacier in Sagarmatha region has receded 30 feet vertically. Right? There will be an increase in river flows until 2030. This is projected to decrease significantly by the end of this century. So you can see that the studies have shown that the glaciers are receding. That is the fact. Studies have already established. And then another fact is that because of this receding glacier, what we are going to come across is we are going to encounter a lot of, let's say, water for a few decades, okay, until 2030 or 2040, we will have plenty of water. Maybe we keep flooding, right, because of glacier melts. And then we don't have any glaciers there, and we don't have any water, and it will have significant impact upon, let's say, lives of the people, agriculture, our water system, and whole human and environmental ecosystem. Now, we have some challenges here also. For example, in Nepal, still we don't have a number of scientific evaluations to understand the types and degrees of impacts on a specific geographical region and development sector. We don't have specific data on these kinds of things. And we need to build comprehensive understanding of impacts of climate change on agriculture system, our water resources, our forests and biodiversity, public health issue, disaster incidents, tourism, and other related sector also. We have these challenges as well to address. And then we have another important challenge, related with these two challenges, that we have inadequate human knowledge, technical and financial resources, right? And another important thing is we need to become a proactive member in international and regional alliances. So these are few challenges which are connected with climate change politics in Nepal, right? Because we have a number of things which are inadequate. For example, human resources, knowledge, know-how resources, technical resources, and particularly financial resources. Okay, these are a big challenge for us to adapt ourselves, right, to complicit ourselves with changing climate. Now, with all these ideas, now we can go to how actually climate change politics works at global stage and then regional stage or local stage. You can see a number of negotiating blocks here. Okay, for example, we have umbrella group 10 countries, which includes the United States of America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, these countries. And they say that, well, okay, if we are able to limit ourselves to 2 degrees Celsius, that's fine. And what kind of treaty, what kind of agreement we need? All inclusive, that's what they think of, right? And which is probably the outcome, as Paris Agreement also. And burden sharing, they believe that developed and developing countries, they need to share the burden as per their individual capabilities. And we have European Union, 27 countries, they are also in between 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. They also believe that all the countries need to be included, right? And then they have also similar kind of thinking like United States of America in the group of umbrella, as they say that we need to have developed and developing countries together, and we need to contribute together, but as per our individual capabilities. And we have another big group, which is called G77, China, almost 130 countries, which includes China, India, Brazil, countries like Nepal, okay, Bangladesh, Maldives, all these, varieties of countries. And they keep arguing that, temperature would need to limit at 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. And they believe that developing countries need to be responsible, okay, for, let's say, addressing climate change. And they focus on historical responsibility of Annex 1. When we say Annex 1, again, they are developed countries, advanced countries. We have AOSIS, about 43 countries, okay, and alliance of these island countries, actually, 43 countries. And they keep saying that we need to limit global temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and developed countries, they should focus on addressing it. They should shoulder all the burden of addressing climate change, and it is a historical responsibility of Annex 1. And then we have LDCs, let's say least developed countries, 49 countries, in which Nepal is also there. And they say that 1.5 degrees, developed countries need to be responsible HR of Annex 1. And we have African Union, about 50 countries, 1.5 degrees Celsius, developed countries, again, historical responsibility of Annex 1 countries. And we have, EIG, economies in, let's say kind of transition, something like that, which is led by South Korea. And then they also believe that, global temperature should be limited at 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. And they also think that developed countries need to be, let's say, need to be responsible in terms of legally binding treaty, as they believe that it is the historical responsibility of developed countries. Now, I would like to draw your attention here in between two different, let's say, groups. For example, as I said, Nepal is member of, let's say, G77, 130 countries also. And Nepal is member of, let's say, least developed countries also. And if you look at, these two groups, in G77, China, 130 countries, you can see 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, and if you look at LDC, it focuses on 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, and the question arises, what is the actual position of Nepal on it then? Okay, that is something interesting that we need to know. And in terms of now, because I was talking about, let's say, G77/China, now you can see this global total energy consumption and almost the emission rate also the same. You can see China is number one consumer of energy, and then the emitter. Okay, United States is number 2, India is number 3. Okay, then are the countries you can see here. Okay, so China is number 1 consumer of energy, total energy, and India is number 3 consumer of total energy. Okay, and Nepal is in between these two giant economies. And then Nepal is member of G77, China, 130 countries, and least developed countries also. Now, Nepal in climate change politics. you know, international climate change, let's say cooperation in Nepal. Nepal is again a member of G77, China, and LDC. When Nepal goes to these international negotiations, which take place every year, at the time, it has, let's say, dual kind of membership. One is membership of G77, another is least developed countries. So Nepal actually aligned with what G77, produces and tables on these negotiations. At the same time, Nepal aligns with LDCs also and table, their position there. Okay, so sometimes it is felt that there's some sort of confusion also. So what is the actual position of Nepal? Okay, that's one thing. And another, we have another, let's say, kind of grouping also, SAARC, Regional Geopolitical Cooperation and Implication. Oftentimes, when Nepal goes to international negotiation, at the time, SAARC countries come together. Okay, when I say SAARC, obviously we have 7 countries, including Afghanistan, and then we have this, let's say, observer country like China. Okay, but particularly this, let's say, SAARC countries, they also sometimes develop some kind of one, let's say, policy that they want to table on this global negotiation, right? But then there are conflicts most often because it's very difficult for them to come up with one kind of document because of their differences. And then another important thing that Nepal needs to realize is Nepal's immediate neighbors, which I have highlighted time and again, China and India and Nepal, right? Sandwiched between China and India. Emerging economies like China and India still haven't explored dirty fuels, right? Still, their almost whole economy is being driven, being propelled by dirty fuel, coal and gas, right? And they are number 1 and number 3 polluters, consumers, right? So it's really serious that Nepal is in between these two countries, whereas Nepal does not or has not industrialized itself, right? And Nepal's emission is very, very minor, okay? However, having said that, when China is developing, India is developing with, let's say, dirty fuel propelled, let's say, engines of economy, pollutions produced by these engines, these machines, they easily go from one country to another because we know that climate change and almost all the environmental problems are transboundary in nature. Okay, so we need to understand that. So one important point here is that, whatever kind of development is being occurred in these two giant economies, right? In India and in China, the side effects, the pollutions, that is being created by those kinds of, let's say, development processes are affecting the water towers of Himalayas, okay? And then they are affecting, let's say, water system, agriculture system, livelihood systems, and lives of Nepal. So then what is Nepal's position on these different points then? Okay, that is something we need to know again. For example, developed versus developing and least developed countries. Okay, generally, when we look at these environmental problems or climate change, usually the idea is that common but differentiated responsibility. It means that environmental problem is common problem, climate change problem is common problem, but we have differentiated responsibility to address that, which means that if the countries are developed, advanced, they have more responsibility, and if the countries are poor or less developed, they may have small amount of responsibility because they are not able to exercise their financial resources, technological resources, right? Therefore, difference in responsibility. And this is very old because this idea was brought in environmental politics, climate change politics, since 1972, right? And that is being said again and again. It's kind of hackneyed, okay? Because what was the situation of the world in 1972 and what is the situation of the world today? That is something, we need to look at. And it's not like black and white. And again, policy also. For example, Nepal is in 2 different groups. So what is Nepal's clear position? Okay, whether it's 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, and why? I think Nepal should make its positions very clear on that also. Otherwise, there is confusion. Sometimes 1.5 degrees Celsius in one group, in another group 1.2 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that is something I think Nepal should clarify in future negotiations also. And burden sharing again, when we say that say that developed versus developing countries, right? Then burden sharing is generally considered to be the responsibility of developed countries, an historical responsibility. But today we can see, a new kind of picture is being emerged. For example, we have blocs like, let's say, cooperation of different countries, okay, like India, China, these kinds of countries, and we have basic countries also. Again, India, China, South Africa, etc., Russia, etc. So we have these kinds of emerging economies, powerful emerging economies, global warehouse of production and consumption, and then global selling also, right? So which wasn't there in 1972, and totally, this global economic system has changed. But then the argument of, let's say, climate change politics or environmental issues haven't changed that much. Okay, so that is, I think Nepal, as a small, least developed countries, need to articulate, I think, its position being politically very correct. And then again, another one is pay and pollute, which is very interesting. If you look at advanced countries, they don't seem to be actually reducing their own pollution, right? Rather, they are willing to pay, not that much, but they keep paying whatever amount of fund for this, let's say, climate change adaptation for least developed countries or developing countries, but they continue to pollute in their own countries. So can we really address climate change if we keep paying but continue polluting? Is another important topic of consideration on which Nepal needs to think about, as Nepal depends on Himalayas and then glaciers, etc. Now, giant dirty fuel economies and Nepal versus transboundary nature of environmental problems. Again, these giant countries are here, just two immediate neighbors, but environmental problems are transboundary in nature. So how can Nepal articulate its interest in, let's say, regional forum like SAARC, global forum like UNFCCC, right? And then trilateral forum, let's say Nepal, India, and China, its position. So that is something Nepal needs to think of. Now, let me summarize what I have said this far. If you look at climate change literature, you can see that climate literature has vividly identified Nepal as one of the most disaster-prone and most climatically vulnerable country in the world. However, Nepal is a LDC, least developed country, buffer country between two giant economies, and they are top first and top third consumers of, let's say, energy and then emitters of the world. And then if you look at similarities in between three countries, you don't find much symmetrical similarities there. Little symmetrical comparisons can be made about economic and developmental stages between these three countries, that they are in the same geographical region and may also share similar climatic patterns. Historically, the developed world was responsible for greenhouse gas emission identified as causing accelerated climate change. But today, instead of developed world, other countries are also engaged in contributing to, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions in large number, even more than developed world. But the fossil fuel dependent Chinese and Indian development model has contributed to large scale greenhouse gas emission, making them belong to the top three global greenhouse gas emitters of the world. Although China and India, because they have still problem there, China and India still have millions of poor people to lift out of poverty. Their emissions rank number 1 and number 3 in the world, and in the eyes of several countries, this places much more climate responsibility on them than they have been willing to accept. Because this is connected with not only Nepal, you can see this climate, global politics of climate change also. Oftentimes, United States of America disagreed in the past to join, let's say, a Kyoto Protocol on the basis that if China and India, they are not going to have any kind of binding, let's say, agreement and targets, then it's going to affect American economy. So they develop this kinds of narrative, which actually put, let's say, on hold the successful negotiation of climate change. Regional cooperation, the SAC label, has the potential to provide an important element in the fight against climate change, right? It has, if SAC becomes functional, but the SAC has achieved very little so far in the making and implementing of regional level climate policies. So we don't have, except when, one environmental outlook that was produced in 2009, we don't have much in SAC, but that can be a good forum that can be revitalized and then work to address this climate and environmental issues of South Asia. Bilateral and trilateral transboundary leverage, hydropower development, and water management agreements can make South Asia energy independent and reduce water-induced disasters, because it has, some implications. For example, if, let's say, the giant economies, they move away from fossil fuel economy to low carbon economy, then Nepal would be less affected. And even India and China, obviously, they would also be less affected. Although the international and regional climate positions of India and China at loggerheads with those of the developed countries, they acknowledge their energy dependency and environmental problems such as air pollution, water pollution, floods, and other forms of water-induced disasters. They can further prioritize environmental concerns at global, regional, and local levels and change their loggerhead positions to leadership to address the climate and environmental challenges. And on it, Nepal can initiate regional climate change dialogues by providing a neutral venue, not only to share their experience in Nepalese context, to make its own policies in tandem with the two neighbors, but also to affect climate policies in China and India and benefit as one of the most climate vulnerable countries. So Nepal can play a very important role in this trilateral relationship as well. Global, leadership, regional leaderships, and then trilateral, this leadership in which Nepal can say it's learning with China and India and, seek some kind of understanding from China and India and change Nepal's climate change policies and help change climate change policies in China and India to benefit, let's say, South Asian countries, including Nepal and China. I think with this, I have said a few things with you. Thank you very much for your participation and listening. I'm very happy to take your questions because I'm sure that I have not covered all the things. If there are questions, I would try to respond to those questions being elaborated.
Dr. Pandey, thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. It was really interesting. We have immensely benefited from it. Let's open the floor for discussion. We have received some of the questions already. So let me put the first question for today. How do you analyze the historical climate change negotiations, including Paris Agreement and Nepal?
Thank you very much, Dr. Pramod, for this question. It's a very good question. In 2014, actually, I wrote one article, Climate Change History Past to Present. I did analysis of this climate change negotiation from 1992 with the establishment of UNFCCC to, let's say, Kyoto Protocol and Copenhagen, right? And Cancun. And what I found from there is that, oftentimes, countries of the world, or let's say leaders of the world, they gather together, right? And they try to do lots of things. There's always loud noise, but ultimately in paper, there is very little, One very important, document that we had was Kyoto Protocol, which had, let's say, binding targets for advanced or developed countries, right? But then, when we look at these kinds of negotiations, obviously these negotiations, they have some kind of, let's say, article or clause which says that if you are not willing to continue, you can withdraw from these kinds of, let's say, protocols or agreements, all right? And, about Kyoto Protocol, when it was about to expire, at the time, Canadian government wrote to UNFCCC because Canadian government had to pay a large amount of money. They wrote to UNFCCC and they said that, well, they are going to withdraw. And then the then Prime Minister of Canada said very clear that, well, by withdrawing, we saved a large amount of money. See, that's the point. And then, in 2012, Kyoto Protocol expired. The first one expired. And then there was negotiations. Copenhagen, in 2009 did not take us anywhere, right? But ultimately, then we achieved this Kyoto 2. But again, there were lots of disagreements. Many countries, they did not feel comfortable with Kyoto 2 also, because Kyoto 2 was also in line with Kyoto Protocol 1, which only asked quantified, let's say, emission targets from developed countries only. So it wasn't very much, let's say, fruitful and beneficial, which lasted until 2020. Recently, it's over. And now we have this, let's say, Paris Agreement, right? We have Paris Agreement that came in 2015. And many people said that it's a great achievement. Yes, in terms of bringing all the countries of the world, including, let's say, America, India, and China, these all countries, they went into this bandwagon of Paris Agreement, claiming that's fantastic. But again, if you review what has happened, until today, and then some of the articles there, what you feel is, well, okay, nationally determined contributions, and these are all voluntary. Okay, you don't have any kind of, let's say, legally binding things there. These are all, let's say, volunteer kind of contributions that each of the countries of the world, they create, they think that they can do, and they send those to UNFCCC, right? And UNFCCC does not have any authority to check whether they have really done it or not, only, compilation of those kinds of documentations. So if you look at the history of this climate change negotiations, what you find is, we have a lot of noise about addressing climate change, but in actuality, we have very little. Because still, if you look at the global economy, almost 81% of global economy, is being run by fossil fuel, right? And only 14%, or even less than 14%, is renewable, right? So until and unless we go up to some 50 or 60% of renewable, the target we are assuming today, that 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, is not going to be achieved. Because clearly, today's literature also shows that if we continue the way we are continuing, at least, by 2050, we'll have 3.6 degrees Celsius, let's say, temperature rise. So even if we keep saying, well, fantastic, taking photos, etc., right? But then in reality, in terms of addressing climate change, looking at policies, looking at reality, in terms of, what is being emitted today, what we see is, very little has been achieved from these global negotiations, very little.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Let me move to the next question. There is a strong politics of North-South divide in climate change negotiations. How do you think Nepal would be able to articulate its interest? And do you also think that the North-South divide is becoming less real in today's context?
Well, that's again another good question, which I discussed quite a lot in my presentation also. For example, when we talk about this climate change issues or environmental issues, we can find, scholars being divided into two different groups, like, the countries. Even scholars are divided. Scholars, most of the scholars, when we meet them in different kinds of forums, and they say that, well, okay, everybody needs to be in the basket. Well, and most of the scholars, for example, myself and many others also, when they go to these kinds of conferences, and they say that, well, it is the historical responsibility of the West, because you developed and then you contributed to emission. And because of that, global temperature rising. So it's your responsibility. So it's continuing for a long period of time. But then, is it really relevant today is a big question, which we need to reflect upon. As I said in my presentation also, for example, we have countries like BASICS, we have countries like BRICS, right? We have countries like China, we have countries like India, Russia, right? Brazil, these big countries which are striving for development because they need to take out a large number of population out of poverty, which is very, very real, which needs to be done, right? That's fantastic. But then the way, business as usual, we are moving forward, okay? The way we are moving forward now, that means they are also contributing quite a lot today. And obviously, climate change issue is not going to be addressed on overnight. Even if we reduce emission today, it may take a number of years, 30 years, 50 years, even 100 years time. So if we only focus on historical responsibility of the advanced countries and other countries don't take this responsibility, obviously, we are not going to address climate change, because we know that we started from 18th century, and today we are realizing that we are becoming victim, right? And the discussion of climate change itself began from 1992. So prior to that, people even did not know. People were thinking that they did very good job, great job. So we need to be much more reflective today. And I feel personally, and I've written in a number of my articles also, we need to reflect back. things have changed. The positions of countries have changed. The status of countries have changed. Once US used to be powerful, giant economy, we have other economies which are much more powerful than US today. So if these positions are changed, obviously, shouldering the burden position needs to be reflected upon, reconsidered, right? That's what I think we need to think of, and that's how it goes on.
So let me move to the next question. What should be the actual interest of Nepal in relation to climate change?
Well, that's a very important question, which I actually wanted to talk in today's presentation also. For example, let's think in simple way, okay, in a very simple way. Let's not, talk in politics way, very simple way. For example, when we talk about Nepal, then I repeat a number of times, for example, water towers of Asia. So we need to protect the water towers, okay, that's the one thing. Another is, we need to protect too much of water and too little water also. Because if we're not able to protect the glaciers today, then we may have plenty of water today or even flooding today, and after 10, 20, 30 years, we don't have any water. So we need to be very much interested in protecting our, this idea of, let's say, glacial lakes, glacial and snows, or water towers, so that we won't be swept away by too much water today, and we won't have any water in the future. And then we keep, strive for water. That's the second, I think, interest. And third is, because connected with this, we have another, let's say, linkage here. When we talk about this too much of water, too little water, and water towers of Asia, it's connected with our life system, because water is life, right? Water is life. Without water, we cannot think of living, right? So water, and this water is related with our agriculture. And this agriculture is related with our food security, right? And food security, again, this agriculture, water, food security is connected with our livelihood, right? Our livelihood, our forest system, right? All these things. So we need to protect our disinterest also. And now the challenge is, how do we articulate these things in international forums and then regional forums, in trilateral forums? Again, I think Nepal needs to be clear. Nepal needs to be clear. Nepal needs to engage in a proactive way in different types of dialogues, regional dialogues, global dialogues, trilateral dialogues, in which Nepal should very clearly show what is affecting it, how it is getting affected by climate change, and how better it can be handled, okay? So that, this immediate neighbors also become interested and then start listening to Nepal, right? So that is something Nepal needs to do. But again, saying simply that, well, okay, I need to control, let's say, global temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's Nepal interest, wouldn't work in global politics. Who is going to listen? Because Nepal is not a giver, Nepal is taker, right? Always in international negotiation, whose voice prevails there is that those powerful countries, right? Powerful countries, for example, US, European Union, India, China, again, all kind of negotiation. Ultimately, they are negotiated when US, India, and China, they become together, right? And we are in between China and India. So we need to be very much politically correct, diplomatically correct, to articulate our interest with these two countries and tap the benefits being offered, or which we will be able to get in the future from these countries. So that's how I think we need to go ahead. Otherwise, most of the countries, from my own studies also, when I was doing my PhD also, I felt like, many countries, island countries and other countries, they keep saying 1.5 degrees Celsius, but they don't have much say except moral and ethical power, right? Most of the power lies with these powerful countries again. Are they really willing to change their engine of economy from business as usual to low carbon economy or not? Okay, so that is something Nepal needs to look at and then try to provoke those things, and then even make, let's say, its immediate neighbors understand about the issue, because this water system is connected with India also, China also, not only Nepal. The water towers belong to India also, China also, okay? So, and millions of people, even billions of people, they depend on this water tower. So Nepal can play that kind of very much proactive, smart kind of diplomacy to address it's let's say challenge of climate change.
Thank you, sir. Let's move to next question. Should not private companies such as Asian Mobile and Shell be held responsible for misleading us and hiding their climate predictions? Should not private companies in general be held accountable?
Well, obviously, yes. Private companies also need to be held accountable. Definitely, yes. That's a very true question. You know, you can see big companies like British Petroleum or Chinese Petroleum. You know, they have always this greenwash tag there. Okay, the greenwash we call greenwash, right? They say that, well, go green, but again, keep polluting that. Okay, and then there is not only the issue of climate change, there is the issue of climate justice, even social justice also. They go to Nigeria, for example, British Petroleum goes to Nigerian Delta, and then it exploits, oil from there. The people who live there are very, very poor. People die because of this oil spread. But then it keeps saying that, go green, right? Similarly, many private companies are engaged because most of, let's say, oil companies are private, except in China and Russia, I think, and in some other countries. Many powerful, let's say, petroleum companies, they are private, and many gas companies are also private. And they develop different kinds of ideas of go green, but again, they keep destroying the nature, and they are highly responsible to climate change of today, particularly global temperature rise. But then one of the important things is that when we say that private sector needs to be made, let's say, responsible, that's what we need to say, and they need to be responsible, no doubt. Therefore, there is this idea of this corporate social responsibility, right? We have that idea also there. But then again, what I highlight that the role of state is very, very important on that, right? The role of state is very important to bring them under certain kind of supervision so that they can do some of the things which are beneficial for global population or national population, regional population. So the role of state is very, very important, but we don't see that in the age of globalization, right? That's another challenge we have today, globalization, because countries can move from one country to another very easily, and they can manipulate, right? They can manipulate, and they are taking advantage of globalization. Even they evade taxes of different countries, right? So state needs to be, let's say, state needs to have mentoring type of role, supervision type of role. There needs to be strong rules and regulations so that companies may not be able to do those kinds of activities, I think. But obviously, if we think in ideal situation, each individual needs to be responsible. In ideal situation, each company needs to be responsible. But in real situation, they don't act in that way, or many companies don't act in that way. And it is the responsibility of the state then to bring those companies in the ambit of rules and regulations and let them function the way they need to function. I think I tried to answer the question. I don't know how far I answered your question.
Like you mentioned about individual responsibilities, that each individual should be responsible. So what can be the ways and means to mobilize and gear individual effort to minimize climate change impact?
I think that is the most important question. When we say that, sometimes I'm afraid of saying that actually, because it's connected with, as I said in the beginning also, it's connected with human life. Because whatever we do, right, it's connected with climate change or let's say some kind of degradation of environment. For example, early in the morning, I get up and I go to bathroom to wash my face, thinking that I become clean. But then I'm using what? Resource water. Right? And sometimes I use water being very careful. Sometimes I use water being very careless. Sometimes I'm brushing and the tap is open. I'm wasting that. Okay. That can be saved in a very simple way. Right. And then we can think of, for example, in Nepal, in India, we can see that there is now a kind of massive interest of people of having private vehicles. Right. And maybe we can think of some kind of public transport system, which is very, very bad in our country, to be honest, right? I can't tolerate it to use public transport. But state, when states are able to develop, let's say, to railway systems like we have in South Korea or other countries, maybe many people can travel in one vehicle, right? And the use of resources, for example, fuel, etc., which is being used by one person. For example, most often when people go to office, one person, one car, right? And quite a lot of consumption of fossil fuel, again, petrol or diesel, right? So if we have some kind of, let's say, this pooling system or bringing lots of people together and mass travel system, right, it can reduce, let's say, global emission. That's another thing. And then, you can go to another kind of culture like we have now. When people come out of, let's say, poverty to middle class, what we have found in studies is that people's consumption pattern changes. They start, living luxury life, wasting of water while taking shower on the one hand, and the meat culture is really growing up, right? Meat culture is really growing up. And it is said that to produce 1 kilogram of red meat, particularly which is consumed in the West, about 16,000 liters of water is required. So what a waste is there, right? So maybe, I'm not saying that everybody needs to go vegetarian, but then there can be some sorts of limitations on that also. So minor things, okay? What we need, right? And then we have thinking here in Nepal and in many countries that, okay, you are one son, you need to have one house in Kathmandu, another house in Pokhara, another house in Butwal, another house in somewhere else. And you are one individual. What the hell you need this many houses there? You don't need, right? There are people who don't have any house, and you are one, you have many houses here. Some kind of, justice there. That can be reduced actually, right? So these are different steps, a number of things that we can do actually, but these are some minor things that we need to understand. And if we start following that, I think we can address it. I'm not saying that we need to give up laptops, mobiles, cars, and go to forest and start living there. I'm not saying that. But then we can be efficient. Efficiency is one thing. We can be more efficient. Although efficiency itself is not enough, we need to focus more on adaptation, more on mitigation. But if all the population of the globe, they start, realizing it and they become more efficient, then things can go to right direction.
Thank you, sir. I mean, yes, even like simple steps like not using paper is one way to contribute to climate change. We try to do our best. Like I mean, we try our best not to use paper at all for printing unless it is extremely necessary. How has National Adaptation Plan for Action 2009-2010 and Local Adaptation Plan of Action 2011 been implemented in our three-level governments? Has our current political instability affecting our adaptation and mitigation programs?
Thank you very much for this question. Actually, as I already said, a lot of things, but it's very difficult to cover everything when you talk. Thank you very much. Particularly when you talk about this local NAPA and LAPA, okay? We are again talk about PAPA and KAPA also, which are not in use, but NAPA and LAPA, in 2010 and 2012, they came, right? And at that time, our country was in unitary system, right? Unitary system. We were not a federal country at the time. We did not have provinces the way we have today. We did not have powerful local government as we have today, right? So this NAPA and LAPA, they were designed to be implemented at that time, right? But ever since, and then we have this NAP also, National Adaptation Program in 2015. Again, that was prior to federal governance system in Nepal. But then after federal governance, things have changed quite a lot. Now local governments are very, very powerful and things can be implemented from local level. However, NAPA and LAPA haven't been designed or redesigned, revised in that way, right? They have not been revised in that way. And they are still in the way they used to be in the past. So they have not been very much effective ever since we have, let's say, federal system in Nepal. And now we need to rethink, revise those, and we can contextualize them into a federal system, right? Understanding that powerful, let's say, our local government is really becoming powerful, and then if NAPA and particularly LAPA is connected to local government, that can be implemented better. In the past, it was focused in some areas, but when we had unitary system, so that was the issue of that time, but now they need to be changed in correct context.
There's one interesting question that Nepal is sandwiched between two world's biggest polluters, India and China. And without their interest, we cannot adapt emission-free technologies as we are more dependent on them. So how can we initiate to address the impact of climate change happening in Nepal? Similarly, Nepal is being less emitter and paying huge cost of climate change. In such a scenario, how Nepal can negotiate with its neighbors, India and China?
Right. That's again very good question. But I think I said some of ideas on how Nepal can actually deal with these countries. Obviously, Nepal is sandwiched between these two powerful giant economies. And then, one important thing is you can change everything, but you cannot change your location, geographical location. So we cannot take Nepal from here to somewhere else. So the reality is that, geopolitical reality is that we are going to be, we are going to be in between India and China, right? And then we need to now look for scope, right? We need to look for scope. How can we better handle this issue? And as I said some time ago, for example, India and China, we can get, these are emerging economies and they have developed different kinds of technologies. For example, for let's say renewable energy, China is doing the best in the world. Okay, almost 14% Chinese energy is now, let's say, renewable energy. That means China has technology. I'm focusing on technology. China has technology. And we can encourage China to use technology, which China is doing. Nepal can also get benefit of those technologies in Nepal. Technology transfer is one of the important, let's say, point, which is repeated again and again in, let's say, global climate change agreements and protocol. So technology transfer is one important thing. So is the case with India. India is also trying to work very hard and then go renewable. So Nepal can get some kind of technological support, from India and China. That's the one way to look at one point. And another is that, Nepal, India, and China, they are in one geopolitical reality. As I said that, for example, water towers don't affect Nepal only. Water towers affect India, water towers affect China, water towers affect Nepal, right? And protecting water tower is not only the interest of Nepal, but of these all three countries. So sometimes, at one point or another point, they can come together, they can discuss and find out smart ways to handle that. Okay. But then Nepal needs to be proactive on that, because sometimes you can see the relationship between China and India is cold oftentimes. Nepal can be a very neutral platform, right? For example, Ishimori is here, right? Other institutions, secretariat is here. We can use these kinds of forum or new platforms we can create, and we can invite both Chinese and Indian, let's say, delegates, leaders, and then engage in these kinds of discussions, and then try to address climate change. I think that's the other important way, which we haven't done quite a lot until today. Because most often when you see that our, let's say, leaders travel to India, our leaders travel to China, they focus on other kinds of issues more than climate or environmental issues. So our leaders also, when they visit to these countries, they need to focus on environmental issues, climate change issues. When they come at the time, also discussion needs to be there also, right? And then only this can get priority. Sometimes like ad hoc kind of things, when Honorable Madhav Kumar Nepal, when he was Prime Minister in 2009 at Copenhagen, let's say, conference, at the time we had this a meeting at Kalapathar to attract, attention of the world. And now in 2020, we had another meeting at Sagarmatha, West Camp somewhere, but we were not able to hold it, but at the time also. But these kinds of events are ad hoc types of events, come and disappear. It should not be like that. It should go continuously. Okay, there should be continuous commitment to carry forward these initiatives. Okay, they should not be like ad hoc kinds of things. Sometimes when people think important, they shout and then keep quiet and disappear suddenly. So there needs to be persistent commitment on these kinds of initiatives as well.
We're running out of time, so let me put the last question for today. If you look at the revised version of climate change policy, Nepal has not done enough, and it must have bottom-up approach, but sadly it is not. Similarly, most of the policy plan are made just to grab funds, designed according to the need and criteria of the funder. In this way, how will the problem of common, marginalized, poor community be addressed that has brought by climate change when our country still struggles to to increase the living standard, because most of the government plan are also donor driven, and there is a huge gap of knowledge and understanding in local government of capacity building and adaptation and mitigation plans.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. What is being said. For example, if you look at our climate change policy of 2011 also in the past, and climate change policy of 2019, right? Obviously, if you look at most of the correspondence or communication that is being made by Nepal to UNFCCC, these are driven by actually donors' idea. The first thing that we need to understand. Even government of Nepal hires international consultants, local consultants, which keep working with them, and then they write these kinds of things, and there is not wider consultation. There's not wider consultation on these issues, how policies can be made better in the interest of Nepal, right? And another important thing we need to understand when you talk about government is that, Nepal has received different types of funds in the name of, let's say, climate change adaptation, right? But when you go to the field, you can see that very little is being done. Although it is said that when you receive climate change fund, 80% needs to go to field and then 20% for administration. But when you look at the realities, actualities of Nepal, what you see is 20%, about 20% or even less goes to field, and 80% is being spent on administrative costs. So it's quite opposite, right? However, the focus is there to bring money, to get fund from Global Environmental Facility or Climate Change Fund, bring the fund here and spend the way people in the government want. Okay, that is very bad reality of Nepal. And it actually hasn't helped the poorest people, the most vulnerable people who have really been affected by, let's say, climate change impacts. And that's very true. And that approach needs to be changed. And we keep saying, like, oftentimes we say, for example, when these policies are, developed, at the time there needs to be wider consultations. Most often they don't do consultation. Whenever they do consultations, also they listen and then they don't, actually change anything. So that is the practice, and that practice needs to be changed. Okay, that bureaucratic mentality, that I know everything, something like that, or hiring a few consultants and whatever they send, well, that's the final thing, because there is, I understand some kind of internal politics of environmental ministry also. I've heard quite a lot about that. So that needs to be changed. Okay, and then a wider consultation, actually going to the field and then understanding the difficulties and the problems of those vulnerable peoples and how that can be addressed. Okay, that's the one thing. And another is, once the fund comes for those people, then that needs to be spent there, all right? And there, I think we need to be morally and ethically correct, which hasn't happened quite a lot until today, and I totally agree with that. There are challenges.
Dr. Pandey, thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. We immensely benefited, and I'm sure we all are more learned than before. We are really grateful for your time. Thank you so much for your presence. We'd also like to thank our participants for their presence and wonderful questions. Have a nice day. Thank you, sir.